session for the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, 66th annual event. I'm Dr. Magdalena Simonis. I'm President of the Australian Federation of Medical Women and Chair also of the Climate Health Action Group of AFMW. And I'm very grateful to you all for attending today and also to the participants for their excellent submissions for this evening's event. Our theme today is Australian Women Doctors, Climate Change and Gender Equity Advocates and Activists, because that is what we are. And we're going to share with you some of the work that we do here and also how we can tackle the climate health and equity issues. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we all meet. Australia is a very large country that was occupied, and the traditional owners of the land have left an amazing heritage which we're learning more about. And I'd like to acknowledge their contribution to our society and to our climate change discussions and honour their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to also acknowledge those of our attendees today who have Indigenous heritage who are with us here today, and thank you for attending. The Australian Federation of Medical Women has made strong connections with other organisations in an effort to address the issues around protecting our planet, maintaining its habitability. And I'm honoured to have a representative from Doctors for the Environment Australia, Dr. Kimberley Humphrey, who is Deputy Chair of DEA, and also Dr. Kate Wylie, who is both a member of AFMW and DEA and has been impactful in creating her own foundation, which we're going to learn more about. This session is being recorded. It will be replayed on Sunday evening, which is for our allocated session for the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women at 11 p.m. AEDT, which is Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra time, and it is 8 a.m. New York time. So you're free to attend that. It will be recorded and played there again for those who cannot attend that evening. And there we'll be speaking to an international audience who have enrolled through the NGO site. Well, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Desiree Yap, AM, who is our Vice President of the Western Pacific region, MWIA, which is the largest of the Medical Women's International regions and represents 9 countries. So thank you for providing your welcome. And please could I ask you all to mute your speakers. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Simonis, and welcome to everybody else. I'd like to welcome all of you to the AFMW UN CSW 66 event on the Australian Women Doctors and Gender Equity Advocates and Activists. I'm speaking from the lands of the Djarood Wurrung, the traditional owners here in the Moyne Shire, and I'm speaking to you from Port Fairy. And I would like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I also want to acknowledge the elders and those past, present and emerging from other communities and lands where some of us who are joining this talk may be contributing from or listening from. AFMW, the Australian Federation of Medical Women, is the voice for Australian medical women's advocating for and supporting the health and welfare of our local, national and international communities. Today, we're hearing from a panel of amazing speakers who will educate and energise us about the issues of climate change and its associated disasters and how it affects women and children more than men. We also look at the importance of activism. We will explore the importance of digital health and its use to advance rural health and health equity, and lastly, how climate denial and the denial of violence against women are in fact quite similar. We will explore how the environment, social justice and the role of medical women joining and acting synergistically can create meaningful change. So welcome to everyone and thank you. I look forward to hearing from all of our speakers.
Thank you, Desiree. And with that, I'll launch immediately into my presentation. And it is that climate change impacts women more than men. And we know that this is the case, as written in the op-ed co-authored by myself and Dr. Kimberley Humphrey and published in the Australian Medical Journal Insight magazine in September 2021. Gender and climate impacts women more than men because we're more disadvantaged. We have family roles, traditionally lower incomes, reduced access to credit, education, resources, technology. And yet, ironically, women who earn spend most of their wages, typically up to 90%, back in their families and communities. So it makes sense that the more power women have, the healthier our communities will be. And we've been shown how much of a disaster coronavirus has been for feminism. In fact, the gender equity gap has increased an entire generation from 99 years to 134 years. And this indicates the mess that we're facing in terms of climate disproportionately affecting women more than men, because we are the most socio-economically disadvantaged people. Up to 70% of women in the world, on the planet, are in a socio-economically disadvantaged position. And at all stages of life, women are more at risk of mental health, and of those with mental health, up to 50% have experienced intimate partner violence. Women are more likely to also develop chronic disease when they're socio-economically disadvantaged, and yet they're less likely to be diagnosed when they do have or present with these diseases. And these inequities are even further exacerbated in our Indigenous communities. So we're seeing a trend that escalates as pressure is applied, and COVID has proven that for us. The bushfires of 2019 and 20 have been catastrophic, and we're still seeing the effects of this. And as a doctor in Melbourne, hundreds of kilometres away from where this occurred, I'm still seeing patients who are experiencing the after effects. And more recently, we've had the catastrophic floods from northern Queensland all the way down to beautiful Sydney, where houses and homes are now being evacuated also. And we're talking about thousands of kilometres of stretches of land being underwater. Our own patron, Dr. Cathy Foley, is Australia's chief scientist, and she is a physicist who acknowledges that climate change is one of humanity's biggest challenges, and that we need a whole range of solutions guided by methodology, and agrees with the World Economic Forum that women contributions are required to solve these challenges, as she's demonstrated through her own work. Even the Business Council of Australia, the boss there, who happens to be a woman, Jennifer Westcott, is urging the Prime Minister to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and is calling for 40 to 50% emissions reduction by 2030 on a path to net zero. Now, this is a 180-degree turnaround from where they stood in the past. And they're connecting this with an economic recovery plan, and is arguing that with the acceleration of emissions reduction, if we take this opportunity, we can take on first advantage in renewable energy, and it will be to the saving of around $5,000 to all Australians. We applaud the effort of scientists and leaders all around Australia who are making these efforts, and Beyond Zero Emissions here in Victoria have described an excellent pre-submission plan here for how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions just through our changing things in our homes. Climate Council of Australia is proposing that we don't need to displace people who work in the fossil fuel industry. We can create clean jobs and work on this problem together. And we also have our friends at Climate and Health Alliance, and we're very proud to have contributed to the healthy, regenerative and just framework for national strategy on climate, health and wellbeing for Australia. And we've also had the benefit and the advantage of being able to write to government with the backup of all these organisations talking about reducing emissions to save lives. So I'd like you to keep in touch with us. These are my details. Link in with me. I use Twitter, and I thank you very much for this opportunity to share this with you.
Thank you very much. Our next presentation is pre-recorded by Dr. Helena Franco, who is co-chair of the Young AFMW. Unfortunately, Dr. Franco can't be with us this evening, so bear with me and I will screen share her presentation.
Got it, Marissa?
Yes.
Thank you very much for having me. Co-chair of Young AFMW and previously worked as an orthopaedic unaccredited registrar before studying a Masters of Medical Sciences in Global Health Delivery at Harvard Medical. Climate change is causing significant health impacts globally through direct or indirect mechanisms. The impact of the global issue of climate change on women's health has been found to be varied across geographical contexts. However, the impact of global health of women may still be summarised. Climate change influences specific women and child health needs. For example, women are directly affected by droughts and heat waves, particularly during menstruation and pregnancy. An indirect effect is that climate change is impacting food security, which is a critical component during pregnancy for the development of the fetus and as an infant. Secondly, factors associated with the exacerbation of climate change on health are more prevalent in low and middle income countries, which are disproportionately experienced by women. For example, 70% of those who live below the poverty line in low and middle income countries are female. Thirdly, the effects of climate change are amplified for women due to their pre-existing economic and social vulnerabilities, such as being less likely to own land, receive education, or benefit from paid labor. The role of women in climate change has been recognised through many agendas, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the World Health Organization. With social determinants of health identified as the root cause of vulnerability for women and children, strategies must be targeted at individual and community levels to address these negative health impacts. This must include purposely including women empowerment and positioning women in those processes that involve health policy to promote community-led strategies. The impact of climate change towards child health and future generations cannot be understated, with climate change threatening to reverse the improvements we've made in global child mortality over the past few decades. It is estimated that children will bear 88% of the burden of disease due to climate change, disproportionately affecting the poor. All children rely on resources from their caregivers and respective communities to buffer them against threats, and these include environmental threats such as climate change. An example of the direct projected impact of climate change on child health is exposure to heat stress. It is estimated that 74% of the population will be exposed to at least 20 days of lethal heat per year by 2100 if current trends continue. Children are more vulnerable to heat stress due to high surface area to mass ratios, particularly as an infant. Another example of an indirect effect of climate change on children is the increasing prevalence of natural disasters, leading to displacement of families and the impact on internally displaced or refugee children. With climate change transcending geopolitical boundaries, there is an enormous and disproportionate effect on the most vulnerable communities, including children and women, and these magnify pre-existing disparities in the social determinants of health in these vulnerable groups. As we move forward, doctors are positioned to reframe this debate from one of political interest to one of significant global health importance. There must be women-specific and child-specific research on climate change and their health, and incorporation of women-specific and child-specific needs in climate adaptation policies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Helena, and good luck for your exams, which are in a few hours. So our next speaker is Dr. Kimberley Humphrey, Deputy Chair of Doctors for the Environment Australia. Thank you very much, Kimberley, for coming to speak with us today.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. I will just try sharing my screen here. Give me one moment. Okay. Now, can everybody see that first slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Lovely. Okay, so welcome everybody. My presentation is talking about how women will save the world and the agency that women can have in this space as well. So not just the significant effects that we've heard about, but what we can do as women to tackle climate change. So women saving the world is not an over-exaggeration. If we're going to tackle climate change in this decade as we need to, we must engage women and address gender inequities at the same time. We will not make the progress that we need to make. There is a lot, I think, that's already been said about how climate change will disproportionately affect women, and the impacts will be felt more by women and more by women who are already marginalised in other ways. Women, we know, have fewer rights and have less freedom and earn less income. So equally, we can emphasise the enormous difference that women can make in this area, as well as looking at why we need to act so urgently. What I'm not going to do is talk about any specific women in this talk. So what I would like to do is to focus more generally on the potential of all women as agents of change, not just those that we know are making an incredible difference. And there's an awful lot of women across the world who are really quite active in this space. So how can women affect meaningful climate change? Women are a fierce source of possibility. Women are raising their own voice in the debate about climate change adaptation. And women are particularly good at doing this because they experience the vulnerabilities that we see in climate change on a greater scale due to the gender divides that we've mentioned. But women are also particularly good at having a sense of what constitutes a bigger climate risk because of their roles in households and in local communities and on the land as well. So particularly good at emphasising the reasons that we need to act as well. So some of this talk will be on the why of positioning women at the forefront of the global climate movement, and some of it will address the how. So why do we need women in positions of power and involved deeply in governance structures? So women are more likely to live a daily life in ways that benefit the planet. Women are more likely to eat less meat, to use cars less frequently, and to drive shorter distances as well. There's been some studies that have shown that men consume 70 to 80% more energy on transport than women in Germany and Norway, and 100% more in Sweden as well. So there's a lot that can be learned from the examples set by women. And this also extends to areas such as recycling, minimising waste, buying organic food, and in buying eco-labelled products as well. So there's just a lot that can be learned from the example that is set. Secondly, why? Investing in education improves the lives of women and all life on the planet. So this is one of the things that we must do. Investing in education will lead to better control over women's reproductive destinies and will give women control over their lives and futures and equip them to make more meaningful change in their societies. So this includes having a comprehensive framework of sexual reproductive health and rights, including family planning, to enable women to achieve their full potential and to create more change in their communities. Why else do we need to act in this space? Women are the world's primary farmers. Women who are smallholders, that is those who farm using small plots, produce 60 to 80% of the food in lower income countries. They do this with less support, fewer resources, and persistent systemic biases and inequities. And due to this, women are less efficiently able to use the land. In many countries, women are not able to own land, and they cannot then use that land to leverage to purchase farm equipment, or they require a male signature to purchase land at all. What we can do is remove these barriers, and this will have significant implications for women themselves, but also for the planet. Every year, deforestation progresses due to the use of clear-cut forestry. If we could empower women to more efficiently use these small plots of land, we could at the same time empower them to more efficiently produce food and have direct effects on climate change. Why else is it very important to act in this space? Women are active and effective agents and promoters of mitigation and adaptation. Women traditionally have skills related to water preservation, harvesting and storage, stewardship of natural resources, and food harvesting and preservation. They have inherited knowledge and lived experience that is passed down through generations, and this contributes to the deep and detailed knowledge that women can lend to mitigation and adaptation efforts. Finally, we know that women in leadership positions tend to put a greater focus on climate change and environmental sustainability. Studies have shown that women in government positions are more likely to sign on to international treaties that reduce global warming. And promoting the participation of diverse women in these leadership positions can also inspire younger women to participate and to create the change that we urgently need in this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next recorded message is also from, the next recorded presentation is from Dr. Emily Horan, who is co-chair of Young AFMW. And I will screen share again.
Hello, my name is Dr. Emily Horan. So climate change and natural disasters pose a significant threat to global health and threaten to widen the existing gender-based health disparities that exist between men and women. This presentation will provide an overview on how women are particularly vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change and natural disasters, and examine the overarching policies and strategies in place to address this. The impact of climate change means that women face higher risks and greater burdens, and this is especially important in areas of poverty where women make up the majority. Across many societies, women are found to have decreased social networking and employment opportunities. In very remote areas, women are subject to gender discrimination and violence when agricultural crops and decreased household income occurs due to natural disaster. They are commonly the last members of the household to eat and have limited rights to their own land and financial independence. Women generally have less access to education and are not given the opportunities to build careers and improve on their socio-economic status. These factors contribute to women's vulnerability to the impact of climate change. So what policy? Climate change can also lead to physical ill health by the exposures listed above. These exposures can lead to adverse reproductive outcomes and also effects on mental health. With environmental disasters and other experiences of trauma, including wildfire and cyclones, demonstrating that populations who have lived through these experiences have symptoms of major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Maternal psychosocial stress in the preconception and prenatal period is associated with adverse offspring and infant development outcomes, and these include obesity, poorer cognition, and dysregulation of socio-emotional development. So what policies are there to address this? The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015. This was with the aim to provide a blueprint for peace and prosperity worldwide. The blueprint was founded on 17 sustainable developmental goals, with 2 of these focusing specifically on reducing inequality as well as tackling climate change. And by adopting these goals, member states promise to focus their attention to raise awareness, collect data, and implement strategies to improve these goals. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change prioritizes equal involvement of women and men in the development and implementation of national climate change policies that are gender responsive. They have an abundance of information available on their website and have ongoing events, workshops, meetings, and resources. The United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction also has a focus on how women and diverse gender identities have distinct vulnerabilities that shape the experience and recovery from disaster impacts, and how this must be considered when informing disaster risk reduction decision-making. The Sendai framework has been created by the UNDRR and is composed of targets and priorities to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risks. The framework consciously integrates a gender perspective into all DRR policies and practices and recognises the need to empower women as public leaders, promote gender equitable and universally accessible responses, recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. The policies I've discussed today provide the framework for countries to continue research, development, implementation and reassessment of their strategies to improve on the impacts of climate change and natural disasters on women. It is our hope that by adopting these overarching goals, we can all work together to reduce the impacts of climate change and support and empower women as educators, caregivers, and agents of social change. Thank you.
Excellent. And now we will thank you, Emily. And now we'll have Associate Professor Deborah Colville present. You're muted, Deb.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you. Can you see my screen there? Just looking for the presentation mode.
Yeah, we can see that. I think, yeah.
I think we'll leave it at that. Yep. Thank you. So, thank you. So I'm going to present a few of the activities that we've participated in as Australian Federation of Medical Women as regards climate change activism. Some of these will be dealt with in more detail by other representatives of the organisations, and I welcome that. So I'm going to mention our participation in policy making in Medical Women's International. Some of us participate in Doctors for the Environment Australia. Some of us participate in Extinction Rebellion, the relevance of the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, and highlight that we contribute also in leadership in social and corporate responsibility. So Emily's kindly oriented us towards the priority theme of this year, achieving gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs, and in particular, Sustainable Development Goal 5, achieving gender equity, and Sustainable Development Goal 13, taking urgent action to remediate climate change. As far as Medical Women's International, for several decades, some of us have been involved in ethics and resolutions participation. This is with usually 43 countries around the world, women doctors contributing approximately 600 to 1,000 women doctors, formulating resolutions that we think are important. And you'll see here just a sample. For example, in 2007, we passed a resolution of agreement with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that not specifically that there's a climate change emergency, but highlighting the extreme negative health and social impacts on many people of climate change. We also acknowledged our responsibility as industrialised nations to take care to avoid climate change and environmental degradation as much as we can. Down the bottom, you'll see here that in 2010, with the support of some prominent AFMW members, we acknowledged that the severe climate effects on internally displacing certain populations, resulting in climate change refugees. A large group of doctors in Australia participate in Doctors for the Environment Australia. I look forward to Kate Wylie's presentation today. And acknowledging that the carbon footprint of Australia's healthcare sector itself is responsible for 7% of Australia's total emissions, and that we as individuals, individual doctors, have a responsibility to minimise this in our own practices and our own hospitals and operations. I've also been inspired by Doctors for the Environment that they've been able to enlist even sometimes very, very conservative and perhaps sometimes lagging colleges such as my own, the ophthalmology, into a coalition of organisations that put forward the notion that we must declare a climate emergency in order to inspire activism and amass resources for this enormous problem. The Australian Federation of Medical Women have liaised with AIDA, Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, and the connection here is that for 65,000 years, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians have been custodians of this land and have looked after the land, water, resources with no carbon footprint that I'm aware of, and that we must support them in this, and that their Indigenous knowledges are just only really just being acknowledged as essential to achieve a carbon neutral future. And just finally, leadership in corporate and social responsibility through governance roles. One of Australian Federation of Medical Women's roles is to support our members in taking on leadership roles in whatever walk of life they find themselves, and leadership in fundamental societal critique with the benefit of feminist informed knowledge, and in particular the comfort that we have that there's enormous social work going on around the world against climate change, and to try and achieve a carbon neutral future has been really helpful to some of us. For example, Extinction Rebellion take action that I think is an offset to some of the activist role that we sometimes is quite pessimistic and or some would say realistic, and that's been extremely useful to some of us. Being able to critique a zero growth economy and ask questions on our boards and in our governance roles about what it means if we don't even have the right language to achieve a carbon neutral future. So I've talked a bit about policy making internationally, Doctors for the Environment, Extinction Rebellion, their role of Indigenous doctors and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their knowledges. Some of us have taken some leadership roles in social and corporate responsibility, and I feel we should encourage this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Dr. Kate Wylie, founder of Climate Medicine, presenting on the topic of becoming a climate activist, getting off the couch.
That's great, and I'm assuming that people can see my screen. That looks fine. All right, look, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Kate Wylie, and yeah, what I want to do is share a little bit of my journey of becoming an activist in the hope that it'll inspire women listening to, you know, get off the couch of themselves and work together to save our beautiful planet. I do just want to quickly just acknowledge country, just acknowledge that the nation we call Australia is stolen land. And First Nations people have never ceded their sovereignty of their land, and they deserve our respect. I'm calling from Ghana Yurta, otherwise known as Adelaide, and hello to a group in Ghana is Namani. So Namani to everybody, and thank you for being here today. A bit about me, I chair the RACGP's Climate and Environmental Medicine Specific Interest Group. I'm on the board of Doctors for the Environment and facilitate our After Hours webinar series. I've written a website called Climate Medicine, and I'm a member of the Al Gore Leadership Corps. These are some stickers that I had made up once, and this is me presenting at a climate rally last year. And this is a picture of my dogs. And the reason why they're there is because, you know, we're focusing on the human health effects of climate change, but what we're doing to our planet affects every living thing. So, you know, you can look at this slide and you can see that obviously I'm very active in the climate and health space. You know, I spend a lot of my time volunteering to become a climate activist, but it hasn't always been this way. You know, if you asked me 10 years ago if I'd be here now, I would have laughed at you completely. 10 years ago, I was this. I was doing an awful lot of this. I was yelling at my computer. I was ranting to my friends and, you know, involved in a fair bit of this, you know, liking the Facebook posts, sharing the memes, but really being pretty passive. But there was a turning point. And the turning point was when this man became Prime Minister. When Tony Abbott became Prime Minister of this country and repealed the price on carbon, I realised that I was no longer satisfied to be passive, that I needed to be active. I needed to work and be part, you know, on the side of the good. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to share 5 pearls of wisdom that I have learnt, you know, during the last 10 years of becoming a climate activist. And the first one is that you need like minds and mentors. You know, finding friends, hanging out with people that share your values and can help you. This is a shout out to my friend Gabrielle Bond, who was my first mentor, and I met her. She taught me how to campaign. She taught me how to be strategic, and I wouldn't be without where I am now without Gabby. And the second thing I learned was that you don't have to get an A+. You know, perfect is the enemy of good. Now, let's just do something, try. And I learnt that from this woman, Eleanor Evans, who is very involved in DEA. And that was one of the first things she said to me, and it inspired me to give my very first presentation on climate and health. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Eleanor. All right. And yeah, the third thing I really learned is the need to just do something. Like, do something. You know, this is a big, vast problem, but it requires lots and lots of different somethings for us to have an effect. You know, and anything you do is something that's done, and it wouldn't be done if you didn't do it. So do something. Anything is better than nothing. That's pearl number 3. This is a picture of me at one of my very first somethings when I went to my local MP's office and dropped off a letter asking him to be more active on climate. One small step for womankind, I called it back then on my Facebook post. The fourth thing I've learned is the world is run by those that turn up. So turn up. You know, if we want to make a difference, if we want to save our planet, and of course we do, we need to turn up for our planet. So let's turn up. And these 5 magnificent women have done lots of good work, parliamentarians, and this person here shows us again how doctors are powerful. I'll talk about her again. My 5th thing that I've learned is the need to be brave and have courage. One of the things I did was I was fortunate enough to stand with Sarah Hanson-Young when she stood up to being bullied by Senator David Leyonhjelm, and I stood in the High Court next to Sarah, and doing that taught me a lot about courage. I so admired the courage she showed in doing that, and it made me braver. And yeah, we need to be brave in this time. We've got a, you know, big, hard job ahead of us. So let's be brave and stand up, because we can do it. We are medical women. We are capable and powerful. We do all sorts of amazing things in our jobs. And if we turn our attention to this climate crisis, we can make a fundamental difference. So let's do it. One last point. I think we all think of being an activist as gluing yourself to a road. And, you know, there is an absolute place for that type of activism, but that's not an activism. That's not for everybody. There are different types. Oh, my clicker's stopped working. Back. There are 4 basic ways that you can be an activist. And if you want to go onto this link with the Commons Library, it shows the 4 different types of climate activists: the citizens, the reformers, the rebels, and the change agents. So look at that and think, which one works for you? Where do you fit in? Because yeah, the world needs all of us. We need all these types of activists working together to create the change that we need. And, you know, we really do need to change, because we are in a code red for humanity. This is the decade for climate action. We don't have time to sit around. We have to get on and do. And yeah, your planet needs you. So yeah, start with one thing and see where it goes. And, you know, together we're powerful. Thank you very much for listening. And that's just the link to my website if anyone wants to have a look. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And we're all fired up and inspired. So that's, thank you for the work you do. That's brilliant.
You're welcome.
I'm now going to, so we've got Madura Naidu. I will introduce Madura. She's President of Victorian Medical Women's Society, and very happy that you're speaking up tonight and on a topic that sort of balances out what Kate Wylie has just been talking about. So Madura, up to you now.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Madura Naidu and I'm an intensive care doctor working in Melbourne, Victoria. When I was a young teenager, around 15 or so, I was struggling in math in school, and so I had a math tutor. He loved talking about politics, something I had absolutely no interest in as a 15-year-old, and I'd listen to him pontificate on in one ear and out the other. He would also CC me on emails that he would send to various MPs and the Prime Minister. I never understood why he did this, but now, all these years later, it actually hit me recently. He was an activist. And that was the first time I was ever exposed to a facet of activism. I'm not an activist though, but I am, as are many young doctors, genuinely concerned about the climate crisis. But many of us remain quiet in climate change activism advocacy. Why? Where does this inaction stem from? Do you identify with some of these reasons? We don't know where to start. There's just so much going on within the climate change scene. And of course, as doctors, many of us are type A personalities who want to do everything perfectly. Climate despair, the mental overwhelm you can get when you read the science and the stats, how far behind we are and how the path ahead is fraught with obstacles. We don't think we'll make a difference, because how can one person do anything? We are not experts, and we're also not the leaders who hold the power to make real, lasting changes. We worry about rocking the boat if we start to ask too many questions or demand changes, especially at the workplace, especially as a junior doctor. We can't see how any change we make now will impact on our future, just like how a smoker who smokes a few cigarettes today is unable to see how the damage from years of smoking can cause significant health problems. So can I, a young doctor, really do anything? I think the fundamental idea to grasp here is that just because you aren't an activist doesn't mean you're not making a change when you do something. I think there are small, manageable, achievable actions that we can all take, and I've chosen to frame some of these actions very simply: educate, engage, and evaluate. The healthcare industry is one of the largest contributors to emissions, so educate yourself on how your workplace is contributing to emissions. Is what you're using every day able to be recycled? Where is the recycling bin in your ward? And how are you disposing of your waste? Choose wisely. In the hospital, do you really need daily blood and imaging tests? Don't do tests that are low value like vitamin D. If you're doing clinics, can you consider telehealth instead of face-to-face, especially if you don't need to examine your patient? How about switching off the computer in the office or doctor's room before you go home if you know no one else is going to use it overnight? As a junior doctor, these are well within your control and simple changes that you can make. Next, engage with intention. Collective power is the most transformational power right now. So contribute to the amplification of voices. Join groups like DEA and CAHA and AFMW. By supporting these organizations, you're giving them more social capital to leverage when it comes to talking to the key people who have the power to make the decisions. Everyone has a voice. It's the most powerful tool you have. Leverage the DR in front of your name. Write letters to put pressure on elected officials. I think it's probably one of the most important collective actions that people can take. Use copy and paste templates that grassroots organizations provide or that you can find online. Doesn't need to be hard. Vote for people who are putting sustainable policies in the forefront, who are putting gender equity in the forefront. These two issues are intricately linked, and people who are thinking of these issues with foresight are the ones that you really want to back. And lastly, but no less important, evaluate yourself. It's sometimes easy to get caught up in the tide and be swept away, or in the other extreme, caught up by analysis paralysis and be stuck. So think about your own values, because this will be your true compass. And this comes back to the concept of temporal discounting, where we value the present more than the future. What is the value of living selfishly now versus changing our behaviors now? Choose the most meaningful actions that are doable for you. I think it's important to find the things that you can do that work for your lifestyle and are within your means. We certainly can't do everything. What are you good at? When you think about stepping into community action, it can be daunting. Use your strengths. If you're good at research, do research. If you're good at organizing, organize. What about redesigning? Think about small areas of control like your department or ward at work. An example is anesthetic trainees who have decided to tackle waste management in theatre. What processes or protocols can you redesign that will reduce consumption? Or if you're doing research, how can you design the research process to be low carbon? The reality is no one person can fix climate change. The crisis isn't going to be solved overnight, but we do not need to be activists to make an impact. We can all be climate leaders by just doing something in our own spheres of influences. And you can start by educating yourself, engaging as much as you can with others, and evaluating your values and capabilities. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Madura. Studying for exams also, I think. Lydia Pitcher is our next speaker. Thank you, Lydia. Oh, you need to unmute yourself, Lydia.
I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you. So I'm Dr. Lydia Pitcher, Vice President of the Australian Federation of Medical Women, and I've been totally inspired by the talks that have gone before me. I'm coming to you from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people in Brisbane, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today I'd like to speak to you on a topic within my narrow field of haematology where I feel I can make a difference, building on what's just been said before by Madura and also Dr. Kate Wylie so eloquently, wanting to educate, change and evaluate in my own sphere in relation to iron deficiency and how climate change is impacting the incidence and prevalence of this in women and how that can be a concern in terms of women's empowerment in many ways. So iron deficiency throughout humanity has been a major cause of preventable and treatable suffering and mortality, especially in women. And also in children, as Helena Franco before me has mentioned. It affects 2 billion people worldwide, and it's particularly prevalent in women of reproductive age when they're at the peak of their potential. As a haematologist, I always look at blood in relation to the pillars, which are, I'd like to remember as A, B, C, D. And iron is at the top of this list, where A is a mnemonic to remember for anemia, iron deficiency impacting on the wellness of our blood. We also have the other important vitamins, B vitamins, vitamin C and vitamin D, but in the hierarchy, iron is the most important. Women have a higher requirement of iron through various physiological processes that we're all familiar with, menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. And it's interesting that when you become iron deficient, your blood cells actually get smaller and counterproductively make bleeding more likely in these situations, exacerbating iron deficiency. And again, as we've learned, there are women who are already disadvantaged, and these factors of disadvantage heighten the impact of changes to our nutrition. It's certainly there are different problems such as lower meat intake, lower vitamin C intake, more enteropathy, more enteral parasites, greater losses in menstruation, having more pregnancies and greater blood losses during pregnancy that lead to a higher rate of iron deficiency in certain groups within our own country, but also internationally, and lead to a higher burden of disease due to iron deficiency. So it's not surprising that an iron deficiency contributes to the disempowerment of women in society, reducing our ability to perform at peak potential, both intellectually and physically, and has wide-ranging consequences, not just fatigue, headache, poor concentration, but also an increase in autoimmune disorder, osteoporosis, heart failure, tissue fragility. In the developing fetus, iron deficiency results in intrauterine growth retardation and stunted growth in the infant and child, and even intellectual impairment if it's prolonged or severe. We've tried to address iron deficiency not just through nutritional changes and education, but particularly in our Western society, there are many new methods to address iron deficiency, oral and parenteral iron, Mirena devices to reduce menstruation, and a global study which the Medical Women's International is looking at in providing tranexamic acid in developing countries to reduce iron loss during childbirth due to reduced blood losses. But climate change can affect all of this and reduce the gains that we've made. We are asked to have a lower meat intake, and also there's also reduced vitamin C intake to address obesity and the impact of fruit juices. With agricultural changes and climate change, there's reduced iron content. And we have greater losses of iron due to catastrophic events and circumstances. And this creates a perfect storm of iron deficiency impacting, increased through climate change and impacting women's empowerment, as I mentioned before. And so we have a a planetary diet where we would like to promote healthy living and also reduce meat consumption. But we must also ensure that in doing so, iron deficiency doesn't become more prevalent and lose the gains that we've made in the last few decades.
I apologise. That's 4 minutes. I apologise. My bell seems to not be working.
Okay. So that will increase the need for more costly hormonal controls, iron supplements, and the precious resource of transfusion. Climate change asks us to rethink dietary and agricultural practices that aim for sustainability and lower carbon production. But at the same time, we must ensure that we continue to empower our women for the future by making sure their iron stores are adequate, and also particularly the vulnerable ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. Marissa, your turn now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today on digital health to advance rural health equity. And I hope you can all see my slides there. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Tarrabalang people, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. On average, Australians living in rural and remote areas suffer poorer health than those in metropolitan areas. They have shorter lives, higher levels of disease and injury, and poorer access to and use of health services compared with those living in metropolitan areas. This data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare states that compared with those in cities, Australians in rural and remote areas experience higher numbers of preventable hospitalisations, reduced life expectancy, higher disease burden, and greater barriers to accessing GPs and specialists than those in major cities. In Queensland, where I live, there are unique challenges to be faced in providing effective and efficient healthcare. On this map, in the red and purple are marked the state's hospitals. All other colour dots indicate rural and community health services. 70% of the state's land surface area is rural or remote, with 38% of Queenslanders living in regional, rural and remote areas and 66% of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander Australians in these areas. One of the many factors contributing to differential health outcomes for those in rural and remote areas is workforce diversity. We know that lack of workforce diversity has detrimental effects on patient outcomes, access to care and patient trust, as well as on workplace experiences and employee retention. Substantial numbers of medical students and doctors hold biased views about race-based differences in, for example, pain perception. Recently, there's been a spotlight on different outcomes for men and women based on the gender of their treating clinician. For example, a reasonably widely disseminated recent study of more than 1 million people demonstrated that women are 32% more likely to die if operated on by a man than a woman. Advances in digital health, accelerated by the pressures and challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, offer opportunities to advance health equity in rural and remote Australia, whilst also minimising the environmental impacts of medical education and healthcare delivery. However, there are significant challenges to be overcome. I'll only touch on some of these issues today for the sake of time. It's hoped that digital health may improve patient care through initiatives that advance the provision of personalised care in an integrated way and by innovations in medical education and training. Advances in healthcare provision may include strategies such as mobile or virtual provision of healthcare, including wearable devices, monitoring at home, patient portals, and the use of smartphone apps. Efficiency of healthcare can be improved by enhancing sharing of information among healthcare providers by tools such as the electronic health record. By reducing unwanted or repeated tests, minimising unwanted and unnecessary admissions to hospital, these tools have the capacity to reduce the carbon footprint of care and to increase the provision of high quality, low carbon care. It's important to realise, though, the significant challenges to be overcome in order to achieve this ideal. Limitations include the need for widespread access to fast, secure and reliable internet and power connectivity, and access to the required devices and adequate training and support for the use of technology for all, including those with physical or cognitive challenges. In addition, though, technological advances in educational resources and in the supporting infrastructure required to facilitate them have the potential to enable equitable access to learning opportunities for those undertaking medical training outside of capital cities. Such advances may influence access to educational opportunities for those from diverse backgrounds, and in turn contribute to increased workforce diversity and improved outcomes for patients and communities. So in summary, we need improved outcomes for patients in rural areas. Diversity in practitioners contributes to optimal patient outcomes, and digital health opportunities may help us meet this need while minimising environmental costs of care. Thank you.
Thanks, Marissa, for that really interesting perspective. Now, would you like to introduce now our next speakers, Liz Rickman and Sarah Burrows, given that you've also got their presentations?
I do have their presentations, and I'm just stopping the screen sharing. And
Sarah, I believe, is going first.
So thank you for the opportunity to present Dr. Sarah Burrows and Dr. Liz Rickman from the Australian Lesbian Medical Association and AFMW are this evening going to be presenting on promoting awareness of the relationships between environmental issues and social justice issues, on how two medical NGOs, AFMW and ALMA, are working towards sustainable future through environmental focused subcommittees. Now, bear with me and I will screen share the first presentation.
Thank you to AFMW for the opportunity to present on behalf of the Australian Lesbian Medical Association, ALMA, together with my colleague Liz Rickman. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land I speak from. I will be talking about having a climate action group in a medical NGO. Then Liz will discuss the importance of applying a gender equity and social justice lens when working to address climate change. With rising greenhouse gas emissions continuing to heat our planet, the International Panel on Climate Change just released their 6th assessment report showing Earth is heading towards catastrophic warming of over 2 degrees. The world's carbon budget is almost spent. Climate change is accelerating and extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and severe, as is obvious in Australia, one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. Accordingly, there are increasing threats to health, water and food supplies, people's livelihoods and national security. The world must cut greenhouse gas emissions substantially and rapidly. Australia's Climate Council states Australia needs to reduce carbon emissions by 75% on 2005 levels by 2030 and be at net zero emissions by 2035. Australia is in fact performing very poorly according to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Climate Change Performance Index. Furthermore, climate change impacts are unequal and unfair, which Liz will speak to. In response to these alarming concerns, ALMA and AFMW have both formed climate action groups. The functions of ALMA's group are to connect with our peak bodies, especially Doctors for the Environment Australia DEA, increasing their capacity and ability to advocate, to support our members around climate grief and climate anxiety and increase their capacity to take action, and to share climate-related information applying gender equity and social justice frameworks. Our actions ALMA's climate group have taken in the last year are collaborating with DEA, promoting sustainability in the health sector through letters to medical colleges, conference sessions, and encouraging members to join or start sustainability groups within their health services. Raising awareness among our members of how climate affects health, the importance of inclusion of the voices of Indigenous peoples, the ecological crisis with the need to protect biodiversity, strategies to cope with our emotions relating to the climate and ecological crises, helping us emerge from overwhelm and back into climate action at work, in organisations and in our personal lives. How and where does ALMA's climate group take these actions? through our enjoyable meetings, conference sessions, which include Indigenous speakers, self-care sessions, group brainstorming, and commitments to actions. Through social media, through building members' capacity to discuss climate and health with patients and colleagues, letters to politicians and colleges, signing petitions, joining campaigns, protests and organisations, and our climate badge. Key actions which have been taken by AFMW's Climate Health Action Group include the op-ed written on climate change and its gendered effects on women, and the creation of a Memorandum of Understanding together with DEA. This is vital and satisfying work, so get thee to a climate action group. Thank you, and over to Liz.
Thank you, Sarah and AFMW. I acknowledge the Gundungurra and Darug people on whose land I speak from today. The less privileged and marginalised disproportionately suffer from the impacts of climate change. By addressing the drivers of social inequities, a more sustainable future is possible. These slides with acknowledgement to Dr. Christine Barden. Women are more vulnerable to the effects of heat, air pollution, and economic impacts from climate change. And pregnant women are unborn even more so. Indigenous women, women of colour, and those in developing countries are even more vulnerable again. When we understand this pattern that works both locally and globally, we see that the drivers of climate change impacts have their roots not just in fossil fuels, but also in the social determinants of health, racism, colonialism, and other forms of discrimination, gender identity, sexual preference, and disability, to name a few. Research shows that a climate justice framework delivers a more sustainable system as well. For example, by increasing land ownership by women, food security is improved, sustainable agricultural practices are increased, and there is increased economic stability, resulting in less migration to urban areas and less trafficking of women and children. By educating women, rate of population increase is reduced, reducing our species footprint. The Climate Change Vulnerability Index is greater in many of the countries who not only are poorer, but also less responsible for having caused climate change. Hurricane Mitch at the time in 1998 was the deadliest Atlantic hurricane with over 11,000 lives lost. I saw firsthand as an aid worker there with Greenpeace the devastation of communities, houses, and lives. In Honduras, where 60% of the population is under the poverty line, with less robust housing and a reliance on agriculture, there was massive homelessness, severe flooding, which devastated income and food security, and led to large outbreaks of disease without the health infrastructure to support. The more vulnerable are more likely to be severely affected and less financially able to be prepared for the increase in climate disasters. More women than men die in natural disasters, and they are more vulnerable to violence in these events. The drivers of global inequity and the issues of climate responsibility need to be addressed as we work towards a sustainable future. ALMA and AFMW advocate the Australian government to increase its commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and to step up its obligations to support Pacific Island nations and address issues of climate migration and refugees. Traditional Indigenous territories encompass 22% of the world's land surface and 80% of the planet's biodiversity. A third of global forests are primarily managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. By incorporating a social justice framework, knowledge of Indigenous foods and land management practices become available to the wider community. As an NGO, we are privileged to have Indigenous members who are part of our group's climate sustainability discussions and conference presentations. This has deepened the understanding in our members that our livelihoods are truly interdependent with the natural world, an idea essential to Indigenous land practices that is so deeply needed by us all at this critical time. Both AFMW and ALMA are committed to supporting Indigenous concerns through advocacy, education of members, and having Indigenous involvement in our conferences. From our own experience, a sustainability group with a non-environmental NGO group has much to do by connecting with their peak environmental NGO, both in linking itself to the larger sustainability movement and also contributing in formulating a sustainable future where social justice issues are addressed and incorporated. Thank you.
Thank you both, Liz and Sarah, for that excellent presentation. Without any more talk, we'll proceed with Marjorie Cross, Anita Hutchinson, and Professor Amanda Barnard's presentations. Thank you. You need to unmute, Marjorie. Are you, Amanda, are you speaking first, or is Marjorie speaking first? You need to...
Marjorie speaking first.
Okay,
great. Marjorie, you're still on mute.
You're still on mute, Marjorie. Is it possible, Amanda, to start with you, if that's okay?
Not really. I mean, it's just that the way it flows, it would be completely back to front. I'm just wondering if any of us, if we are co-hosts, we should be able to unmute Marjorie. Marissa, can you unmute her?
I'm trying to, and I can't.
Marjorie?
Let me see.
Marjorie, you're muted.
Yeah, we can't hear you. You're muted. It's just that we've got 15 minutes to go.
Sure, I know.
So I think.
I mean, if you want me to start, it's just
I'd
that
like to. Sorry, Amanda. It's
okay.
Just, yeah.
Okay.
And then when Marjorie sorts it out, so if you could proceed.
Yep, I will. Yep. Now tell me if you can see this. Can you see my screen now?
You can indeed. Thank you.
Okay. So we've been talking about the issue of violence in particular against women, and how violence against the planet is in fact violence against women and vice versa. And my really was coming in at the end to talk about some ways forward when we're thinking about these issues. And the first one was education. And interestingly, when we look back at what's happened about climate action, and I'm really thankful for some of the young doctors we've had here, it's really very much been student-led. There have been articles in the literature since about 2009 saying we have to include education about climate health, but really they've only been gaining momentum in the last 4 or 5 years. And so there is now some teaching about climate and climate health and the importance of climate change, but it tends to be fairly sporadic, workshops, seminars here, which can be fantastic. But really, as an underpinning, it still doesn't exist, and many of us would argue that it needs to. So what can we do in way forwards? I think as we need to educate about climate and health, we also need to educate our young doctors about disaster preparedness. However much we try, we know that the reality of extreme weather events is going to be part of our lives in Australia. And as medical professionals, we are all going to be touched by it in some way or another. And the other thing I think we need to do is really, and this seminar is a really fantastic example of this, really work across disciplines. I mean, I think some of the early work about climate change came from public health physicians, and fortunately over the last couple of years, I think as a nation, we have really started to recognise how important our public health physicians are. But it's very much an issue about teaching about cross-discipline. But I think in all this, underpinning it is that notion of teaching through a gender lens. We certainly need to teach about climate health, but we need to teach it through a gender lens, because if we don't do that, if we continue in the paradigm in which we've been doing, we are going to, as our speakers have been saying before, we are really going to miss an awful lot of care for half of our population and half of the world's population. Now, let me just get on. Okay, so the other thing I just wanted to touch on briefly was the important role of primary care in disaster preparedness. We've learned from the bushfires and the floods here that the role of primary care in disasters goes far beyond prescriptions. That primary care physicians, that GPs are in fact the central coordinators of community health during the disasters, because of their local knowledge and because of their trust and ongoing connection with the community. So in Australia over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of work done of starting to integrate local trusted clinicians in with the broader often defence-led, SES-led drama of recovery operations. So the second thing I want to talk about was policy and gender awareness and women at the centre of disaster management planning. And most of the pictures you see really celebrate the sort of heroic masculinity of disasters, firefighters and so on and so forth. In fact, in Victoria at the moment, I think, 72% of the fire and emergency service people are men, and 80% of them in leadership positions are. But within this, there's interestingly been, and this is in my Victorian colleagues, a real move to have gender awareness and women at the centre of disaster planning policies. And there's a great little paper that I'm just going to read you a little bit out of, which is called Gender Toilets and Evacuation Centres, and it grabbed my attention. It all started with a question about a toilet. The emergency management team at a particular city wanted to know how to label toilets so as to be inclusive of all people in evacuation centres. And if you just think back to my first slide there, which was a picture of our local evacuation centre during the bushfires. Knowing the evidence of increased gender-based violence and inequalities during and post-disasters, the toilet question was just the beginning. I'm sure the team were not expecting my extensive questioning that was to follow. Questions like, have you thought about women and girls who have their periods? What about bottle-fed babies, breastfeeding mothers?
Amanda, we're already 5 minutes, sorry. We're already,
sorry.
So if you can just...
Okay, consider the needs of transgender men and so on and so forth. So interestingly, there are gender and emergency management guidelines now that are available. And advocacy, I think, after all I want to say, after the amazing talks we've had about advocacy, is that climate, we need to add to the Lancet Commission's report, the most critical social determinant of health is gender. I think we all accept that statement, but to me, it's lacking that. And I think that's what as women's medical groups we can advocate for. Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. Now we have Marjorie Cross presenting for herself and also for Anita. And I think that's about going to be wrapping it up. We're at 9:21. So Marjorie, you have the last two sessions.
Well, at least I can talk now. I can't quite find the slides, but at least I can talk. So I just want to make sure that we bring this together on the idea of we are Australian women doctors in primary care who've witnessed the direct impacts of environmental disasters in Australia throughout our lifetime, and particularly in the last 3 years. We have no doubt that the increasing incidence of environmental disasters in Australia is as the result of human-induced climate change. And there's accumulating evidence of these disasters. And it's our lived experience. We've all given witness to it tonight. It's our lived experience as working women doctors that violence and intimate partner violence in the disaster recovery context carries potentially unique implications due to all the same factors that contribute in the first place to intimate partner violence, plus the added issues from any disaster, for example, such things as limited safe housing. I'm just going to ask Marissa if you can put my slides up.
Sure, just give me half a sec.
So I was going to lay out the links between the environmental disasters and human-induced climate change, discussing the mega fires and the floods that followed them and the current floods that we're now experiencing in Eastern Australia. For years, experts have been studying the links between natural disasters and violence, with evidence suggesting events like earthquakes, hurricanes, bushfires, all can unmask or exacerbate domestic abuse, particularly against women as a result of factors like trauma, financial hardship, unemployment, and drug and alcohol use. Domestic violence in the disaster recovery context carries potentially unique implications due to limited safe housing, loss of community networks. So we wanted to put to you the arguments that the devastating bushfires that we've been part of in southeastern Australia and the floods that all the eastern seaboard is experiencing now are something that has increased and there has been increasing incidence of domestic violence as a result of the disasters we're facing. So the basic outline was to outline the increased incidence of gender-based violence in and after natural disasters. And one of our heroes in the sphere of prevention of violence and abuse against women and girls is a woman who's written a book in the last couple of years in Australia about ways to try to prevent domestic violence. And at the same time, she's pointed out that the limits of our patriarchal system, our obsession with control and nature's indifference to it, which seems to me a really great way to look at how women need to be involved. Women need to be involved in the management of disasters and the management of domestic violence, which come as a consequence and are even more thoroughly an issue after environmental disasters. So one of the other things that's important to point out is the women who, and this is what Anita wanted to speak to, is the incidence of gender-based violence in and after environmental disasters, and the important place of women with lived experience of gender-based violence and how these women must be at the table in addressing recovery and management of climate change-induced environmental disasters. There is a need to expand the collective understanding of intimate partner violence, which after all is an issue of power and gender inequity. There's a need to expand the collective understanding of intimate partner violence and include this in the post-disaster setting to better meet the needs of impacted individuals and communities. So for years, experts have been studying the links between natural disasters and violence, with evidence suggesting that there is an increase in violence of all kinds, but particularly intimate partner violence affecting women and girls after environmental disasters. There's a lot of research in Australia from the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria, and very much more recently, this paper that was just up in the screen a few seconds before from the Victorian group and by Robin Molyneux, talking about the women disclosing violence in the...
Marjorie, I'm going to have to interrupt. We're at 5 minutes and 23 and we're at 9:27, so we will be finishing up at 9:30 on the dot, which would be so just letting you know.
No problem at all. I simply wanted to actually underline Amanda's point of the role that women play in disaster recovery, the role that people who have been impacted by violence play in disaster recovery, and the work that's been done by Australian women doctors, particularly primary care, with respect to furthering the work of disaster recovery and even disaster prevention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you, everybody. Now we're at 9:28 and we have had an exceptional panel speak today, and we all ran a little over time, and it's inevitable. We've got so much to say, and and they're really rich topics. And I think that as a collective voice, we've indicated how strongly we feel about these issues, and that we're all working away. And bit by bit, Kate, as you said, and as Madura said, and when Madura and I had a chat about what she was going to talk about, you know, I don't have something to talk about. I said, well, talk about why you have nothing to talk about or why you think you haven't. And I think it's just what that brings out in us also is what we probably should be thinking about. So thank you for also the work that you do. I'd like to close the meeting